Padilla tried to ambush J.D. Vance on live TV seconds later. It backfired hard. One sentence dropped like a bomb, and Padilla was never the same. The smirk vanished, the debate turned, and the nation saw the truth live. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe, so you don't miss the moments they hoped you'd overlook. The moderator welcomed millions of viewers across the country to what was promised to be a critical discussion on ethics, leadership, and public trust. But behind the pleasantries and political stagecraft, tension crackled just beneath the surface. Senator Alex Padilla, visibly determined, leaned into his mic. He had something to prove after months of damage control from a scandal involving alleged financial impropriety. This was his shot at redemption or revenge, and his target was clear: Vice President J.D. Vance. As the moderator began introducing the topics, viewers at home could feel the air shift. This wasn't just a discussion, it was a confrontation. Waiting to erupt from the outset, Padilla struck first. His tone was sharp, almost accusatory, cloaked in formality, but filled with barbs. "Mr. Vice President," he said with a forced smile, "you talk a lot about integrity, but how do you define that word? When your own party shields billionaires and disregards working families?" Vance didn't flinch. He folded his hands, calm, composed. His response wasn't immediate. He let the silence stretch, just long enough to make Padilla uncomfortable. "Integrity," Vance finally said, "means doing what's right, especially when no one's watching. And Senator, that includes telling the truth even when it's inconvenient." The line landed like a stone in still water. The studio grew quiet. Padilla quickly moved to pivot. He referenced policies, past votes, vague accusations, but behind every phrase was a clear goal: to shake J.D. Vance, to trap him into defensiveness, to undermine his credibility on national television. And yet, Vance didn't bite as Padilla's attacks grew more desperate. Viewers began to notice something striking. Vance wasn't playing the same game while Padilla circled talking points. Vance was waiting, studying, and it was becoming clear he had something to say, something final, but not yet for the moment. Vance remained steady, deflecting with patience, choosing every word like it mattered. And for the viewers at home, the question grew louder: what is he waiting for? By the end of the first segment, the balance was already shifting. Padilla, once so sure of his advantage, now appeared restless. Vance had said little, but somehow he'd said everything. And just when people began wondering whether this debate would change anything, it did, because what came next wasn't a typical rebuttal. It wasn't a zinger, it wasn't even loud. It was a single sentence that stopped everything. And we'll get there, but not just yet. The second round of the debate opened with the topic that had loomed over Senator Padilla for weeks: financial transparency in government. The moderator didn't hold back. "Senator Padilla, recent reports suggest inconsistencies in the funding of your latest re-election campaign. How do you respond to concerns about undisclosed donations?" Padilla's expression tightened. He had prepared for this, smiling through the pressure. He leaned forward and launched into what sounded like a well-rehearsed defense. "Let me be clear," he said. "Every dollar was accounted for under the law. What we're seeing here is a smear campaign, an attempt to distract from real issues affecting Americans. It was a classic move: redirect, deflect, and accuse." But what he didn't expect was that Vance wouldn't jump in. He wouldn't interrupt. He just listened. And then, as the moderator turned to Vance, the stage quieted again. "Vice President Vance, do you believe these allegations against Senator Padilla should be taken seriously?" Vance looked directly into the camera. His voice was low and deliberate. "I believe the American people deserve answers, not from me, not from headlines, but from the senator himself. Transparency isn't a political weapon, it's a responsibility." The audience leaned in. Viewers at home sat up. It wasn't flashy, but it struck a nerve. Padilla responded with fire. He accused Vance of grandstanding, of hypocrisy, of using the vice presidency as a shield. "You want to talk about transparency?" Padilla snapped. "Let's talk about your silence when your donors benefit from deregulation. Where's the integrity in that?" But again, no reaction. Vance didn't blink, and that silence, it spoke louder than Padilla's outrage. What Padilla hadn't realized was that he was walking into Vance's timing, because with each jab, Vance wasn't just staying quiet. He was drawing a line, letting Padilla dig deeper in. Viewers noticed social media began to light up. Clips were already circulating. Hashtags emerged mid-broadcast shash. Vance unshaken hash. A Padilla pressed sash truth matters behind the scenes. Campaign staffers were watching with concern. Padilla's team whispered into earpieces Vance's. Calm focused, waiting the moderator shifted topics, sensing the heat but the damage had started. Padilla's tone had turned defensive. His answers sharper, but also shakier. Vance, on the other hand, kept repeating a quiet pattern: wait, listen, respond with clarity. And then he did something no one expected as Padilla tried to pivot again. To a vague anecdote about his upbringing, Vance cut in. Not loudly, not rudely, just enough to interrupt the rhythm, Senator, he said. We all have stories, but this debate isn't about your past. It's about what you're doing now. It hit hard, no anger, no insult, just a clean, honest blow, and once again, Padilla was off balance. The camera cut to a wide shot, two men. Two styles, one unraveling, one waiting, but the sentence that would change everything, it still hadn't been said. Not yet. The tension in the studio became impossible to ignore. Padilla leaned forward more often now. His voice slightly raised. His sentences came faster, less polished. He was trying to regain control not just of the debate, but of the narrative that had begun to slip from his grasp. He moved toward economic justice, listing numbers, proposals, endorsements. It was meant to show command, but it came off like noise. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance just watched. The moderator posed a question that turned the atmosphere even colder. Vice President Vance, do you believe your opponent has demonstrated the character necessary to lead in this political climate? It was a trap, an open invitation to attack, but Vance didn't take it. I believe character isn't about what we say when the lights are on, he said. It's about the choices we make when they're off. The public doesn't need more finger-pointing. They need honesty, humility, and the courage to admit when we failed. There it was again, measured, focused, intentional. But this time Padilla laughed, an actual audible scoff. You speak of humility, said, but you sit there pretending to be above it all while your allies benefit from backdoor deals. If we're going to talk character, let's talk facts. And with that, he pulled out a document. It was theatrical, held up just high enough for the cameras to catch this. Padilla declared as proof of a fund you once co-chaired that lobbied against consumer protections. The room stirred. Producers backstage shifted. The moderator asked for clarification, but Vance remained perfectly still. He waited for Padilla to finish. Then he asked one question. Did you read the second page? Silence. Padilla blinked. Excuse me, Vance continued, calm and clear. The second page of that report explains that the lobbying effort you're citing was not approved by the board, myself included, in fact. I voted against it. That's public record. The moderator quickly nodded. That is true, Senator. The documents confirm. Mr. Vance dissented for a moment. Padilla didn't know where to look. His mouth opened, but no words came. It was the first time all night he seemed unsure, and it showed. The audience murmured. The cameras caught it all. Vance didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just looked at it. Padilla and added one sentence. I'm not here to perform. I'm here to tell the truth. It wasn't the sentence, but it was close, and it was enough to change everything. Social media exploded. Analysts whispered in real time that Padilla's credibility had taken a hit. Clips from the exchange were already trending. Memes, quotes, reactions, and yet the debate wasn't over. There were still questions to answer, still one moment left that would define it all. The one sentence that hadn't been said was coming. By now, the power dynamics had clearly shifted. Padilla's opening confidence had melted into controlled frustration every time he leaned in with aggression. Vance answered with restraint. The contrast was jarring. One man was on edge, the other looked like he had already won, but hadn't claimed it yet. The moderator, sensing the change, tried to steer the debate back to policy, immigration, education, infrastructure, but viewers weren't focused on policy anymore. They were watching the pressure build. When asked about border security, Padilla tried to reclaim his footing. We need compassion. We need reform, but we also need to stop treating immigrants as scapegoats for broken systems. He turned toward Vance. Again, eyes locked, and what we don't need is political theater designed to make people afraid. It was subtle, but the jab was clear this time. Vance responded quickly. No one's scapegoating anyone, he said, but we have to stop pretending that ignoring the law is compassion. Real leadership means protecting both opportunity and order. It was the first time. His tone sharpened just slightly, and it was enough to make Padilla react. You talk about law and order, Padilla snapped. But let's not forget that your office blocked investigations into financial fraud in your own state. Where was your integrity then? The moderator raised a hand asking for sources. Padilla brushed it off. It's all public. It's out there, but the shift was obvious now. Padilla wasn't quoting reports, he was throwing darts. Vance waited, and then he said something that stunned the room, not because it was loud, but because of how quiet it was, Senator. I've faced accusations before, but unlike you, I didn't hide behind lawyers or staff. I showed up and I answered the line. Didn't draw applause, it didn't need to. It landed. Padilla shook his head but said nothing for a moment. The studio was completely still. The moderator, slightly hesitant, moved the discussion forward, but you could feel it. Something had changed. It wasn't just that Vance had countered another jab, it was the way he did it. By pointing to something Padilla couldn't touch, accountability, the kind that doesn't come from spin. It was at this point that millions of viewers began realizing they weren't watching a normal debate. They were watching a collapse, slow, unspectacular, but undeniable. And yet there was still restraint. Vance wasn't striking. He was setting the stage, and everyone watching knew. He was waiting for something, not an applause line, not a viral moment, but a very specific opening, one sentence. That's all it would take, and the nation could sense it was coming. The next segment was Buell as the leadership round, an open discussion. On trust, vision, and public service. For most debates, this was the cool down, the part where both candidates tried to sound presidential. But this wasn't most debates. The moderator gave them the floor with a prompt. What does leadership mean to you? And how have you demonstrated it in crisis? Padilla took a breath, then launched into his answer. He spoke of community resilience and recovery after the wildfires in California. He mentioned late nights with local leaders, the calls with FEMA, the grants he helped secure. It was detailed, well-paced, and yet it felt like it was missing something, connection. Vance didn't interrupt. He didn't even move. He just waited when it was his turn. He leaned in slightly and began slowly. Leadership, he said, isn't about how many press releases you write. It's about the decisions you make when no one's writing them down. He paused. It's about telling people what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. There was something about his tone. It wasn't political, it wasn't rehearsed, it was personal. He talked briefly about visiting a town in Ohio, hit hard by job losses, about a father who told him he didn't trust anyone in Washington anymore, not Democrats, not Republicans, no one. And Vance had looked him in the eye and said, I don't blame you. That was the moment the audience stopped breathing, because what came next was something rare, a politician admitting Washington had failed, and not someone else's failure, his. I told him I hadn't done enough, that I'd listened more than I'd acted, that I would do better. Then he looked back at Padilla. And the truth is, Senator, that's something you haven't said once tonight. Padilla opened his mouth to speak, but didn't, because now the floor wasn't his. Vance wasn't attacking anymore. He was confronting. You want trust, Vance continued. Start by owning your choices, because leadership isn't just about good ideas. It's about being accountable when things go wrong. Padilla's expression shifted, something between disbelief and anger. He adjusted his mic, cleared his throat, tried to regain footing, but the audience wasn't with him. The tone had changed for the first time in the debate. It wasn't about policies. It wasn't about records. It was about character, and suddenly all the applause. Lines Padilla had prepared didn't matter, because Vance wasn't debating anymore. He was leading, and the entire room could feel it. Still, the final moment hadn't arrived, the moment when everything would crystallize into one unforgettable line. That moment was now just one question away. The moderator glanced down at her notes, then looked up with a sharp shift in tone. Vice President Vance. Earlier this year, Senator Padilla faced scrutiny over undisclosed financial ties to a regional infrastructure firm that later received federal contracts. Do you believe this undermines his ability to lead? Padilla immediately raised his hand, ready to object, but the moderator gestured firmly for silence. The question hung in the air. Every viewer, every reporter, every campaign staffer knew this was at the moment that would define the night. Vance looked straight ahead. He didn't rush, he didn't smile, he simply answered, I believe leadership is about trust, and trust is earned one decision at a time. Then he turned toward Padilla. And when a senator fails to disclose that a company he privately invested in receives a federal contract after lobbying for it, that's not an oversight. He paused. That's betrayal. Padilla's face went still, no counter. No spin, just a stunned silence. The moderator tried to interject, but Vance wasn't finished. I'm not here to smear you, he said. I'm here to tell it's truth, and the truth is you didn't tell the American people the full story. You let them believe it. Was clean, but it wasn't. Padilla found his voice again, but it cracked slightly. You don't have the full context. He snapped the ethics. Committee cleared that situation. Vance nodded once they cleared the paperwork, not the judgment. That line cut deep. Because while the facts may have been technical, the message wasn't. It was moral. It wasn't. It's just a blow. It was the blow, the one sentence that brought the entire room to stillness. They cleared the paperwork, not the judgment. It echoed social media. Lit up. That line spread faster than any other moment of the night. News alerts popped up. Anchors paused their commentary. Even opposition analysts admitted it was brutal but fair. Padilla sat motionless. The moderator had more questions, but no one was listening anymore because the moment had happened. The sentence that couldn't be walked back had been spoken. And it wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it didn't need to be. It was surgical. One sentence, one shift. The entire debate turned on a dime. And for those watching across the country, it wasn't just a takedown, it was a reminder that in politics, sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a shout or a headline. It's the truth delivered at the exact right time, and J.D. Vance had just delivered. It the moment lingered. Padilla tried to respond, but his words came slower now. Measured, careful, uncertain. Gone was the commanding tone he had brought into the studio. In its place was something closer to defense explanation, damage control, he clarified. Timelines, he mentioned staff, he brought up legal language no one remembered, but no one was listening for details anymore. They had already heard what mattered. Vance didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. He had already spoken the sentence that couldn't be unsaid, and now the fallout began. Cable news networks cut in with flashing banners. Vance confronts Padilla over ethics. Live analysis coming up. Clips were already going viral. Pundits on both sides started shifting their tones, even some of Padilla's usual defenders began using phrases like unforced error and miscalculation in the studio. The silence after Vance's sentence had changed everything. It wasn't just the audience's perception. It was Padilla's posture, his rhythm, the slight tremor in his voice. The debate was still technically happening, but the contest was over now. It was just exposure, and as Padilla answered follow-up questions, trying to pivot back to policy, the moderator looked toward Vance again. Do you have a final thought? Before we move to closing statements, he nodded once. I think Americans are tired of explanations, he said. They're tired of carefully crafted answers and technical excuses. What they want is character, someone who doesn't need to be reminded that. Public service is about serving, not benefiting. The line didn't sting, it didn't mock it, reminded, and that's what made it powerful, because Vance wasn't just debating Padilla anymore. He was speaking to every viewer who had lost faith in the people they once voted for, and he was saying, I see it, I hear it, I won't insult your intelligence. Padilla, sensing the shift, tried one last appeal. I've made mistakes, he admitted, but I've always put the people first. It was the closest he'd come to vulnerability, and for a split second, it almost worked. But then Vance looked at him, not with contempt, but with clarity. Then, own them fully. Not when you're cornered, not when the cameras are on, but when it matters most, when no one's watching. That final line settled like a verdict. The debate was nearly over. The stage lights hadn't dimmed. The moderator hadn't closed the segment, but the energy in the room had shifted completely. The audience wasn't wondering who won anymore. They were wondering how long Padilla would try to pretend he hadn't lost, and that more than any polar headline told the real story. By the time the debate ended, the real conversation had already moved online within minutes. Vance's one sentence, they cleared the paperwork, not the judgment, was trending across every platform. Clips of the exchange dominated feeds. Commentators couldn't get over the precision, the delivery, the silence that followed, and more importantly, what didn't happen after Padilla never recovered on major networks. Debate panels replayed the moment again and again. Some tried to soften it, calling it a tough but fair critique. Others said it was a masterclass in restraint and timing. Even neutral outlets had to admit Vance hadn't just won the debate, he had shifted the narrative, and outside the media bubble, the impact was even clearer. Polls that had shown Padilla neck and neck with his future challengers now reflected something different. doubt a growing sense that despite years in office, something about Padilla's story didn't feel right anymore. Voters in California were interviewed that night, and their answers were sharp. I didn't know about the contracts. One woman said, but now I wonder what else we don't know. I'm not a Republican, said another, but I believe in accountability. Vance had it, Padilla didn't. That was the key. Vance didn't win the debate because of policies. He didn't throw punches, he didn't yell, he simply made people believe that he wasn't hiding anything, and Padilla, no matter how many words he used, couldn't offer that same confidence back in Washington. The ripple effects started immediately. Senators and representatives from both parties began issuing statements. Some defended Padilla, others distanced themselves privately. Members of his team were asking hard questions. Could this have been avoided? Why wasn't he better prepared? And most importantly, would there be fallout? The answer was already clear. Yes, because debates don't just reveal how candidates speak, they reveal who they are when they're pressured, and Padilla, cornered by a single sentence, revealed far more than he meant to J.D. Vance. Meanwhile, returned to his hotel without fanfare, he didn't give a fiery press conference, he didn't gloat. He didn't need to, because the country was already doing the talking for him that night. Editorials began appearing with headlines like "The Vice President's Lesson on Leadership," one line that changed a political career. Truth delivered quietly and in homes across the nation. The debate replayed not as a battle but as a reckoning. People weren't debating who was right anymore. They were asking something deeper. Who do I trust? And for once, the answer didn't feel complicated. In the days that followed, Senator Padilla avoided the spotlight. No major interviews, no fiery press releases. Just a brief, carefully worded statement that thanked the debate moderators and reiterated his commitment to public service. But the silence spoke volumes behind closed doors. Democratic strategists were already in crisis mode. Internal polling showed a sharp drop in trust, donor confidence, wavered key endorsements that had been lined up quietly stalled, and as Padilla attempted to return to routine Senate work, the questions didn't go away. Reporters followed him down hallways. Senator, do you stand by your explanation from the debate? Will you release more details about the contract disclosures? Do you think the Vice President was fair in his criticism? He offered variations of the same answer, no comment at this time, but the pressure was building then in a closed-door meeting with senior staff. Padilla reportedly said something unexpected. I should have answered it differently. Those 6 words made their way out to the press, and while they weren't dramatic, they were revealing because they were the closest thing to an admission. The senator had made not of guilt but of miscalculation. He hadn't just lost a debate, he had misread the moment. He thought Vance would come in swinging. He thought it would be a typical political brawl instead. He got dismantled slowly, quietly, by someone who never raised his voice, and the country noticed. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance's team was inundated with media requests, morning shows, nightly news magazine profiles. Everyone wanted a quote, a sit-down, a headline, but Vance declined most of them. When asked why, his staff released a short statement. The vice president said what he needed to say on the debate stage to the American people. There's nothing to add. That response to went viral because in an era of spin, spectacle, and endless commentary, silence had once again become the most powerful message. And for J.D. Vance, it wasn't about victory laps. It was about showing that real leadership means knowing when not to speak back on Capitol Hill. Padilla began to fade from the front page, not because the issue was resolved, but because it no longer needed explaining. People had made up their minds. The debate hadn't ended with fireworks. It ended with clarity, and Padilla, in trying to fight his way through it, had only made Vance's case stronger. By the time the week closed out, most Americans had already moved on, but they hadn't forgotten. They remembered the moment, the look, the pause, the sentence. And that memory carried more weight than any future campaign speech could undo. After the debate, something unusual happened. Not a scandal, not a resignation, just a shift, a quiet one. Padilla was still in office, still voting, still delivering speeches on the Senate floor, but something fundamental had changed. The authority in his voice was gone. Constituents who once defended him now expressed disappointment. Not rage, just something colder, disbelief. He had survived politically, but morally, the damage had been done, all because of a single line. They cleared the paperwork, not the judgment. It became more than a quote, it became a filter. Other politicians were suddenly asked similar questions. Was it legal, or was it right? News hosts invoked the phrase when analyzing new ethics cases. Commentators cited it and oped. College debate coaches used it to teach delivery. Corporate leaders referenced it in boardrooms because it wasn't just what Vance said. It was when and how he said it at the exact moment it mattered most. And that stuck. As for JD Vance, he didn't speak much about the debate after that night. He went back to work focused on legislative priorities, held meetings, skipped the press circuit, but the public remembered. Approval ratings climbed, trust metrics surged, and more than that, people across party lines began using words rarely associated with Washington politics: principled, measured, steady. For a vice president often criticized for being too soft-spoken, the debate had reframed his image entirely, not as passive, but as controlled, strategic, and most importantly, honest. Years from now, when analysts look back at that moment, they may not remember every policy detail discussed that night. They won't recite all the questions or cross talk, but they'll remember the turning point, the breath, the pause, the precision, and one sentence that sliced through political noise like a scalpel, a reminder that truth delivered with timing and integrity doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to be undeniable. And in that moment, on that stage, JD Vance didn't just win a debate, he restored something, a piece of trust, a sense of seriousness, a glimpse of what politics could be if it stopped chasing applause and started chasing principle. And that's why the silence after his sentence wasn't empty. It was full of everything people had been waiting to hear without even knowing it. Not spin, not spectacle, just one line that said it all.